The annual harvest festival at Street Mary Mead possessed that particular quality of English autumn gatherings, simultaneously cozy and competitive, where neighborly affection mingled uneasily with the sort of petty rivalries that could simmer for decades over a disputed garden boundary or a prize-winning marrow. Miss Jane Marple, seated on a weathered wooden bench beneath the spreading chestnut tree, observed the proceedings with the gentle attention she reserved for all human behavior, her knitting needles moving in their familiar rhythm, while her sharp blue eyes missed nothing of significance. The village green had been transformed into a tableau of rural abundance. Trestle tables groaned beneath displays of magnificent vegetables, homemade preserves, gleaming like jewels in their glass jars, and an impressive array of pumpkins arranged near the ancient iron gate that separated the churchyard from the green. The very gate the children had christened Pumpkin Gate years ago, when old Mrs. Weatherby had first begun the tradition of decorating it each autumn. "Quite the turnout this year," observed Mrs. Dolly Bantry, settling beside Miss Marple with a satisfied sigh. "Though I must say, there's been rather more tension than usual over the pumpkin competition." Miss Marple's needles paused almost imperceptibly. "Oh dear, has there? It's that dreadful Mr. Cornelius Blackwood." Mrs. Bantry continued, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Moved into Ivy Cottage last spring and immediately began holding forth about scientific agricultural methods and proper soil management. Poor Mr. Weatherby is beside himself. His family's been winning the pumpkin prize for 30 years. Across the green, Miss Marple could observe the object of this discussion. Mr. Blackwood, a thin, sharp-featured man in his 50s, standing proprietarily beside an enormous orange pumpkin that dwarfed all competitors. His manner suggested the satisfaction of someone who had proven an important point. Nearby, elderly Mr. Weatherby examined the rival entries with the expression of a man watching his life's work crumble. "Science versus tradition," murmured Miss Marple thoughtfully. "Such conflicts do bring out interesting aspects of human nature." The judging was scheduled for 3 o'clock, presided over by the Reverend Leonard Clement and Mrs. Price Ridley, whose authority in horticultural matters was considered unassailable. As the appointed hour approached, a small crowd gathered around the display, their conversations carrying that particular edge of forced civility that indicated deeper currents of feeling. Young Dr. Haydock moved among the villagers with professional cheerfulness, though Miss Marple noticed how his gaze lingered on certain faces with the concern of someone who understood the physical manifestations of stress. Mrs. Blackwood, a nervous woman who seemed perpetually apologetic for her husband's pronouncements, hovered at the edge of the crowd, wringing her hands. It was precisely at 3:15. Just as Reverend Clement was preparing to announce the winner, that Mrs. Sampson's piercing shriek shattered the afternoon's genteel atmosphere. She had been walking her small terrier near the pumpkin gate when the dog had begun barking frantically at something behind the decorative display of corn sheaves. The crowd surged forward with that mixture of horror and fascination that accompanies all village crises. There, slumped against the iron gate's ancient stonework, was Mr. Cornelius Blackwood. His tweed jacket was disheveled, his spectacles had fallen askew, and a dark stain spread across his waistcoat. Beside him, his prize pumpkin lay shattered, its orange flesh scattered across the grass, and protruding from the largest fragment was the bone handle of what appeared to be a carving knife. Miss Marple rose slowly from her bench, her knitting carefully tucked away. The harvest festival had claimed its first victim, and Street Mary Mead's peaceful autumn afternoon had transformed into something far more sinister than horticultural rivalry. Haydock was the first to move, his medical training overriding the natural human impulse to recoil from such violence. He knelt beside Mr. Blackwood with practiced efficiency, pressing 2 fingers against the man's wrist before examining the dark stain spreading across the waistcoat. The crowd drew back in an instinctive circle, as if death itself might prove contagious in the gentle afternoon air. "I'm afraid there's nothing to be done, Doctor," Haydock announced quietly, his voice carrying the weight of professional certainty. "He's been dead for some time, 20 minutes at least, possibly longer. The body's already beginning to cool." He adjusted the fallen spectacles with gentle respect before rising to face the gathering villagers. Miss Marple observed from her bench with the sort of attention she might give to a particularly complex knitting pattern. From her position, she could see not only the tragic scene, but the fascinating array of human reactions surrounding it. Mrs. Blackwood had pushed through the crowd with surprising determination for such a timid woman, her face white with shock, though Miss Marple noticed how her gloved fingers were stained with something pale and granular bone meal, perhaps, or flour from the cake stall. "Cornelius?" Mrs. Blackwood whispered, reaching toward her husband before Dr. Haydock gently caught her arm. "We were just discussing the judging arrangements." Reverend Clement had taken charge with the calm authority that came naturally to those accustomed to managing parish crises. "Mrs. Bantry, perhaps you could telephone for Inspector Slack. And we must ask everyone to step back from the immediate area. Nothing must be disturbed." As Mrs. Bantry hurried toward the vicarage, Miss Marple's keen eyes began cataloguing details that others, in their shock, were overlooking entirely. The carving knife, protruding from the largest pumpkin fragment, bore the Women's Institute, marking Mrs. Price Ridley had mentioned lending it for pie cutting. Yet the blade was remarkably clean, and the bone handle showed a faint ridge where grease had been recently polished away. Someone had taken care to make it presentable. "Terrible business," Colonel Melchett declared, arriving with remarkable speed, "though I suppose these horticultural competitions can become rather heated. Still, murder seems rather extreme, even for a prize pumpkin." The word murder rippled through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water. Young Tommy Simmons, who helped his grandfather maintain the church grounds, stood frozen near the gate, his face pale with what might have been guilt or simply youth's natural distress at confronting mortality. His grandfather, old Ben Simons, kept a protective hand on the boy's shoulder while scanning the crowd with watchful eyes. Miss Marple noticed other details as well. The gate's latch held open by blue prize ribbon, the knot clumsy and hurried, faint orange smears marking the path beyond the gate. Near Mr. Blackwood's shoe, a small brass button lying bright as a new penny in the grass. She also observed that the decorative corn sheaf nearby showed signs of disturbance. Twine had been cut rather than untied, its frayed end suggesting haste. "It's that Weatherby, mark my words," Mrs. Bantry whispered upon her return, her eyes darting toward the elderly farmer who stood apart from the crowd. "All that fuss over scientific methods versus tradition. Poor Mr. Weatherby's family has won the pumpkin prize for 30 years running." Mr. Weatherby himself stood ramrod straight, his cap clutched in weathered hands, staring not at the dead man but at the shattered prize pumpkin. "Waste," he muttered, low and bitter. "All that growing, and for what?" "For what indeed?" Mrs. Price Ridley snapped, though her eyes kept returning to the carving knife. "Institute knife, Reverend. I lent it specifically for slicing pies. It certainly shouldn't be stuck in vegetables." Miss Marple's needles resumed their gentle rhythm as gossip began to eddy through the crowd like autumn leaves. Young Timothy from the bakery confided that Mr. Blackwood had been insufferably critical, always complaining about unscientific bread-making methods. Old Farmer Giles grumbled about unwanted advice on crop rotation, while Mrs. Sampson's sister insisted she'd seen the deceased in the cider tent twice that afternoon. The sound of heavy footsteps announced Constable Evans's arrival, red-faced and earnest. "Right then, nobody leaves the green until Inspector Slack arrives," he declared, positioning himself importantly by the gate. "This is now a crime scene, it is." Miss Marple studied the positioning of the body with growing interest. Mr. Blackwood had fallen against the gate in a manner suggesting he'd been facing away from his attacker or perhaps had turned to flee. The theatrical placement of the knife in the pumpkin seemed almost deliberate, as if someone had arranged the scene for maximum dramatic impact. "Poor man," sighed Mrs. Bantry. "Though I must confess, he wasn't our most popular newcomer. All that talk about proper soil management did ruffle feathers." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, her gaze taking in the nervous faces around them, though one does wonder whether ruffled feathers alone could lead to such drastic measures. After all, it was only a pumpkin competition. The distant sound of a motor car announced Inspector Slack's imminent arrival, and Miss Marple settled back to observe how the various players would perform under official scrutiny. In her experience, it was often during these first crucial moments that people revealed the most about their true natures and their potential guilt. Inspector Slack emerged from his motorcar with the brisk efficiency that characterized his approach to village crimes, a mixture of professional competence and barely concealed impatience with rural sensibilities. His sharp eyes swept the assembled crowd before settling on the scene by the pumpkin gate, and Miss Marple observed how his expression shifted from routine annoyance to genuine interest as he took in the theatrical arrangement of Mr. Blackwood's body beside the shattered prize pumpkin. "Right then," Inspector Slack announced, removing his notebook with practiced authority. "Dr. Haydock, you've confirmed death?" "Indeed, Inspector. Approximately 20 to 30 minutes ago, I'd estimate. Single wound to the chest, though I haven't disturbed the clothing for a thorough examination." "Doctor." Haydock gestured toward the dark stain spreading across the deceased's waistcoat. "The positioning suggests he may have been turning away when struck." Inspector Slack knelt beside the body, his examination methodical and thorough. With his pencil, he carefully lifted a small, bright object from the grass near Mr. Blackwood's feet. "Brass button," he announced, holding it to catch the afternoon light. "Fresh break, by the look of it. Smooth edge, bit of engraving worn down." He looked up at the assembled villagers. "Anyone missing a button?" There was a general rustle as hands moved instinctively to jackets and cardigans. Colonel Melchett's blazer remained intact. Mr. Weatherby's old tweed sported leather-covered buttons, and Reverend Clement's cassock offered no enlightenment. Mrs. Blackwood hugged herself more tightly, and Miss Marple noted again how her gloved fingers bore that faint, granular dusting bone meal. She was increasingly certain, though the woman's nervous tremor suggested more than gardening concerns. "Now then," Inspector Slack continued, "I'll need a precise timeline. Mrs. Sampson, you discovered the body at what time exactly?" "3:15, Inspector. Or thereabouts." Precious started barking, something fierce behind the corn sheaves, and when I went to investigate. Mrs. Sampson shuddered, her small terrier still trembling in her arms. "And who can account for Mr. Blackwood's movements this afternoon? When was he last seen alive?" The responses created the familiar chorus of village testimony, overlapping, contradictory, and revealing more about the speakers than the subject. Mrs. Price Ridley insisted she'd discussed proper labeling procedures with him near the preserve table at 2:30. Timothy from the bakery claimed to have served him tea and a scone at 2:45. Old Ben Simmons muttered about seeing the deceased examining other competitors' pumpkins with a magnifying glass, poking about where he wasn't wanted. Miss Marple's attention drifted to the faces surrounding this interrogation, cataloguing reactions with the same careful attention she gave to dropped stitches. Mrs. Blackwood stood apart from the crowd, her earlier shock having settled into a peculiar composure that might suggest either profound grief or careful calculation. Young Tommy Simmons had grown increasingly pale during the questioning, his eyes darting repeatedly toward his grandfather. "The weapon," Inspector Slack observed, examining the carving knife protruding from the largest pumpkin fragment, "appears to be from the Women's Institute collection. Rather theatrical placement, wouldn't you say?" Mrs. Price Ridley bristled with indignation. "I lent that knife specifically for pie cutting. Inspector, it's been properly maintained and sharpened. I certainly didn't expect it to be used for such purposes." Who had access to this knife during the afternoon? Well, anyone helping with the refreshments, I suppose. Timothy borrowed it at 2:30 for slicing spice loaf and returned it promptly to the serving table. Inspector Slack made careful notes, though Miss Marple observed his tendency toward the obvious suspects. His gaze lingered meaningfully on Mr. Weatherby, whose 30-year winning streak had been threatened, and on Mrs. Blackwood, whose domestic circumstances remained largely mysterious to the village. Mr. Weatherby. Inspector Slack addressed the elderly farmer directly. You had strong feelings about Mr. Blackwood's innovations, I understand. Weatherby's jaw tightened. I spoke plain about his methods, Inspector. Science isn't everything, and his comments about traditional farming were uncalled for. But I wouldn't kill a man over pumpkins, whatever my feelings about his superiority. Yet you were seen near the gate shortly before the discovery. Church path runs by there. Tommy and me carried that corn sheaf this morning, tied it proper with good hemp twine. Someone's gone and cut it since then. Miss Marple's needles paused, almost imperceptibly, as she studied the disturbed corn sheaf. The twine had indeed been cut, rather than untied, its frayed ends suggesting haste. Near the gate, a blue prize ribbon held the latch open, its knot clumsy and hurried, quite different from Tommy's careful work elsewhere. Young Tommy, when questioned about the ribbon, stammered that Mrs. Price Ridley had instructed him not to touch the gate itself. Said presentation mattered, sir. I didn't tie that ribbon. Inspector Slack examined the gate more closely, noting the orange smears that marked the path beyond fragments of pumpkin flesh that suggested someone had passed this way recently, perhaps carrying evidence of their deed. Behind the decorative display, he found a crushed ivy leaf and, in the soft earth, the narrow indentation of what appeared to be a woman's heel, pressed deep as if someone had stood there under considerable stress. Mrs. Blackwood. Inspector Slack turned his attention to the widow. When did you last speak with your husband? Her voice trembled as she replied. At 3:20, Inspector. He said he wanted to check the weight tag one final time. He was so particular about proper presentation. Her eyes, Miss Marple noted, kept returning not to her husband's body but to the scattered pumpkin fragments, as if something there distressed her more than death itself. The investigation was proceeding along predictable lines, but Miss Marple found herself increasingly intrigued by the small inconsistencies that Inspector Slack's methodical approach was overlooking. The polished knife handle, the theatrical arrangement, the careful cutting of twine, all suggested someone who had taken time to arrange the scene for maximum dramatic impact. In her experience, it was often the tidy people who could not resist tidying up after themselves, even in the aftermath of murder. Inspector Slack concluded his preliminary examination with characteristic efficiency. Everyone will proceed to the vicarage for formal statements. No one leaves the village until further notice. As the crowd began to disperse under Constable Evans's supervision, Miss Marple remained seated on her bench. Her knitting resumed, watching the human drama unfold with the patient attention of someone who understood that the most revealing moments often came when people thought themselves unobserved. The harvest festival had indeed claimed its victim, but Miss Marple suspected that the true harvest of secrets had only just begun. The vicarage drawing room, ordinarily reserved for parish committees and genteel tea gatherings, had transformed into an unlikely theatre of criminal investigation. Inspector Slack established his temporary headquarters near the window, where afternoon light fell across his notebook with professional precision. Constable Evans positioned himself by the door with officious importance, while Reverend Clement moved quietly among the assembled villagers, offering comfort and weak tea in equal measure. Miss Marple settled into a corner chair with Mrs. Bantry, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm as she observed the fascinating tableau of human nature under stress. From her vantage point, she could study not only the formal proceedings, but the revealing interplay of glances, gestures, and carefully guarded expressions that often proved more illuminating than spoken testimony. "We'll proceed systematically," Inspector Slack announced, consulting his notes. Mrs. Blackwood. If you would be so kind as to provide your statement first. The widow approached with the hesitant movements of a bird uncertain whether to flee or remain. Up close, Miss Marple observed again the faint granular dusting on her gloved fingers flour, as she had claimed, though the consistency seemed rather coarser than what one might expect from cake preparation. "You last saw your husband at 20 minutes to 3? Inspector Slack inquired, his pencil poised. "Yes, Inspector." He was concerned about the weight verification for his entry. Cornelius was most particular about accuracy. He feared someone might question his measurements. Mrs. Blackwood's voice carried a tremor that might have been grief or nervous tension. "He mentioned wanting to speak with the steward about proper documentation. Did he express concern about any particular individual? Any specific threat or disagreement?" Mrs. Blackwood's gloved hands twisted together. "Not specifically, though he did mention that someone had been interfering with his display, moving things about. He suspected jealousy, Inspector, though he wouldn't name names." Miss Marple noted how the woman's eyes avoided the window where the crime scene remained visible beyond the glass. There was something in her manner that suggested knowledge carefully withheld rather than simple ignorance. Inspector Slack dismissed Mrs. Blackwood and summoned Mr. Weatherby, whose entrance carried the dignity of a man accustomed to facing life's difficulties with stoic determination. The elderly farmer stood straight despite his obvious weariness, his weathered hands steady as he faced the inspector's scrutiny. "You had public disagreements with Mr. Blackwood regarding agricultural methods," Inspector Slack stated rather than asked. "I spoke my mind about his fancy theories." "Yes," Weatherby replied firmly. 30 years I've been growing prize pumpkins using methods my father taught me. This Blackwood fellow arrives with his chemical fertilizers and scientific lectures, telling everyone our traditional ways are backward. I didn't appreciate his superior attitude." "Your whereabouts between 2:30 and 3:15 this afternoon?" Weatherby's jaw tightened slightly. "I was at my display until nearly 3, speaking with visitors about proper cultivation. Then I walked to check the corn sheaf arrangement. Young Tommy had done good work this morning, but I noticed someone had disturbed it. Cut the twine clean through with a blade, they had." Miss Marple's needles paused, almost imperceptibly. The cutting of the twine suggested someone who needed quick access behind the decorative display, someone in considerable haste who couldn't afford the time required for proper untying. "You saw no one near the gate during this period?" "Saw Mrs. Blackwood earlier, around 2:30. She had a small basket, covered with a cloth, and seemed to be adjusting the decorative arrangements. Kept looking about, nervous-like." Inspector Slack made careful notes, while Miss Marple filed away this confirmation of suspicious behavior. A covered basket suggested premeditation, while the nervous surveillance indicated someone operating under considerable stress. Young Tommy Simons was called next, his pale face betraying the strain of the afternoon's events. Old Ben Simons accompanied his grandson, maintaining a protective presence that spoke of deep family bonds. "The corn sheaf by the gate," Inspector Slack began. "You arranged it this morning?" "Yes, sir. Grandfather taught me proper knots, hemp twine tied with slip knots that hold secure. But someone cut through it with a sharp blade." "Not untied, Inspector, but cut clean through." "You're certain of your work?" Ben Simmons spoke up with quiet authority. "Taught the boy myself, Inspector. His knots don't come loose easy. Someone wanted quick access behind that sheaf, and they didn't want to waste time with proper untying." Miss Marple observed the genuine concern in the old groundskeeper's weathered features. His testimony carried the weight of decades of careful craftsmanship and attention to detail. Mrs. Price Ridley approached the questioning with her characteristic mixture of authority and indignation. The Women's Institute knife was properly maintained and returned to the serving table at 2:45. "I wiped it myself. We don't tolerate grease on Institute property." "Who had access to the knife after that time?" "Anyone with sufficient disregard for proper procedures," she replied tartly. "Though I did notice someone behind the corn sheaf around 3 o'clock saw a pea-green hat feather, quite vulgar. Might have been Mrs. Sampson's sister, who refuses to remove her hat regardless of propriety. Miss Marple's attention shifted subtly to the hall, where coats hung on wooden pegs. A bottle green coat with brass buttons caught the afternoon light, and she noted with interest how one button appeared to be missing from the middle position. When Muriel Finch was called for questioning, Miss Marple observed the gap where a brass button should have been. The remaining buttons showed a wreath design, their engraving worn nearly smooth, with age matching exactly the button Inspector Slack had recovered from the crime scene. "I scarcely knew the deceased," Miss Finch declared with defensive hauteur. "I was near the cider tent, then walked toward the gate because Precious was pulling on his lead. I certainly didn't go behind any corn sheaves, the stalks would snag my stockings." "Your coat appears to be missing a button," Inspector Slack observed with professional interest. Miss Finch flushed deeply. "Lost it on the train Tuesday last. My sister will confirm it. We searched the entire carriage compartment." Mrs. Sampson nodded loyally, though Miss Marple noticed the slight hesitation that suggested sisterly solidarity rather than certain knowledge. As the questioning continued, Miss Marple found herself increasingly intrigued by the small inconsistencies that Inspector Slack's methodical approach was overlooking. The theatrical arrangement of the crime scene, the careful attention to staging, and the curious behavior of several witnesses all suggested a mind capable of considerable cunning, someone who understood how to misdirect suspicion while ensuring another would bear the blame. "Inspector," Miss Marple interjected gently as the formal statements concluded, "you might find it worthwhile to examine Mr. Blackwood's weight tag more carefully. In my experience, people who are very particular about documentation often leave quite revealing impressions of their concerns." Inspector Slack nodded curtly, though his attention remained fixed on Mr. Weatherby as the most promising suspect. The elderly farmer's public animosity and proximity to the crime scene made him an obvious target for official suspicion, yet Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that the true solution lay in more subtle directions. As the afternoon wore on and formal statements were completed, the drawing room buzzed with the inevitable gossip that followed village tragedies. The consensus seemed to favor Mr. Weatherby as the obvious culprit, his long-standing resentment providing a convenient explanation for the shocking crime. Yet Miss Marple remained quietly skeptical, her experienced eye detecting the careful orchestration that suggested a far more complex and calculated mind behind the murder at Pumpkin Gate. Following Miss Marple's gentle suggestion, Inspector Slack returned to the village green with renewed purpose, the assembled villagers trailing behind with that mixture of morbid curiosity and genuine concern that characterized all parish crises. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the crime scene, where Constable Evans maintained his vigilant watch over the cordoned area with officious determination. Inspector Slack approached Mr. Blackwood's prize pumpkin display and carefully examined the weight tag that Miss Marple had recommended for closer scrutiny. The small white card, pinned with apparent precision to the entry placard, bore the deceased's meticulous handwriting in dark blue ink. However, under the stronger light and Inspector Slack's more focused attention, curious details began to emerge. "Interesting," the inspector murmured, angling the card to catch the light properly. "The string securing this tag has been retied different twine entirely from the original hemp cord, and the knotwork is quite different from young Tommy's careful technique elsewhere." Miss Marple approached with her characteristic gentle interest, her keen eyes taking in details that others might overlook. How very particular of Mr. Blackwood to make such adjustments, though one does wonder what prompted such careful revision of his documentation. Dr. Haydock, who had remained to assist with the medical aspects of the investigation, leaned forward to examine the tag more closely. "The ink shows different consistencies as well, Inspector. There appear to be faint impressions beneath the current notation, earlier figures that have been carefully erased and written over." Mrs. Price Ridley, overhearing this technical discussion, bristled with characteristic indignation. "Are you suggesting irregularities in our competition procedures? The Women's Institute has maintained scrupulous standards for 40 years, Inspector. Our methods are beyond reproach." "I'm certain they are," Miss Marple replied soothingly, though her attention had shifted to other revealing details scattered around the display area. Near the base of the weighing station, she observed small granules of what appeared to be coarse sand or fine gravel, along with a whisper of damp muslin caught on a nearby stake. Inspector Slack knelt to examine these materials more closely, his professional interest clearly piqued. "Lead shot," he announced, after rolling several granules between his fingers. "Very fine grade, the sort used for adding weight to fishing lines or other objects requiring additional heft." The implication hung heavy in the autumn air, like morning mist. Someone had been manipulating the competition weights, and the evidence suggested Mr. Blackwood had either discovered this deception or had been practicing it himself. Miss Marple's attention drifted to Mrs. Blackwood, who had followed the group back to the green with obvious reluctance. The widow's earlier composure had grown increasingly brittle throughout the afternoon, and her gloved hands showed that persistent granular dusting that Miss Marple had noted earlier. When Mrs. Blackwood shifted her small handbag from one arm to the other, there was a faint rustling sound that suggested contents more substantial than typical feminine accessories. "Mrs. Blackwood," Inspector Slack addressed the widow with new authority. "You mentioned that your husband was concerned about proper documentation. Did he express specific worries about the accuracy of his entry's recorded weight?" The woman's face grew notably paler. "Cornelius was always meticulous about scientific precision, Inspector. If he made any adjustments to his documentation, it would have been to ensure absolute accuracy in his measurements." Miss Marple observed how Mrs. Blackwood's eyes kept darting toward her handbag, and how she seemed particularly distressed by the sight of the scattered pumpkin fragments rather than her husband's tragic fate. The widow's nervous behavior around the display throughout the afternoon suddenly took on new significance. Dr. Haydock had been examining the carving knife protruding from the largest pumpkin fragment with growing professional interest. "Inspector," he called, "you should know that this knife couldn't possibly have made the fatal wound. The blade is far too broad, it would have torn the fabric of his waistcoat rather than creating the narrow puncture I observed. Someone has staged this scene quite deliberately." Inspector Slack's expression grew grimmer as the implications became clear. The theatrical arrangement of the crime scene, the manipulated evidence, and the careful misdirection all pointed to a calculating mind, determined to conceal the true circumstances of Mr. Blackwood's death. Miss Marple remained quietly observant as the investigation proceeded, her experienced eye detecting the careful orchestration behind what others might see as simple village tragedy. The hidden clue was revealing itself gradually, not in any single dramatic discovery, but in the accumulating pattern of deception that suggested someone far more cunning than the obvious suspects had orchestrated this elaborate charade. The Pumpkin Gate mystery was proving more complex than anyone had initially suspected, and Miss Marple found herself increasingly intrigued by the psychological sophistication required to arrange such an elaborate deception while maintaining an appearance of shocked innocence among the gathered villagers. The discovery that the carving knife could not have inflicted the fatal wound cast an entirely different shadow over the investigation, transforming what had appeared to be a crime of passion into something far more calculated and sinister. Inspector Slack's expression hardened as he surveyed the assembled villagers with renewed scrutiny, his methodical mind now grappling with the implications of deliberate misdirection. "If not the knife, then we're looking for something narrow and sharp." "Doctor," Haydock observed, his medical expertise lending authority to the assessment. "A puncture wound suggests a stiletto, an awl, or perhaps a long hatpin, something that could penetrate deeply without tearing the fabric." Miss Marple's attention had shifted to Mrs. Blackwood, whose nervous behavior around her handbag had become increasingly pronounced throughout the afternoon. The widow clutched the small leather bag as if it contained something of vital importance, her gloved fingers still bearing that telltale granular dusting that had caught Miss Marple's observant eye. "Mrs. Blackwood," Inspector Slack addressed the widow with newfound directness, "you've been carrying that handbag rather carefully all afternoon. Perhaps you'd be so kind as to show us its contents?" The color drained from Mrs. Blackwood's face as she fumbled with the clasp, her hands trembling so violently that the bag nearly slipped from her grasp. When it finally opened, a small muslin pouch tumbled onto the grass, bursting upon impact and scattering fine lead shot across the path in glittering cascades. The collective intake of breath from the assembled villagers spoke volumes about the significance of this discovery. Mrs. Price Ridley's face registered shocked disapproval, while Mr. Weatherby's expression shifted from defensive concern to grim vindication. "Lead shot," Inspector Slack observed, kneeling to examine the scattered pellets. "The same material we found near Mr. Blackwood's display." "Mrs. Blackwood, I believe you have some explaining to do." The widow's composure finally crumbled entirely. "Cornelius insisted on it," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the autumn breeze. "He said everyone employed some form of enhancement, that it was simply evening the playing field. He called it scientific weight optimization and prepared the pouches at home with mathematical precision." Miss Marple observed this confession with the gentle attention she reserved for all human frailty. "And you came to remove the evidence this afternoon?" "Yes," Mrs. Blackwood admitted, tears beginning to flow. He'd grown concerned about potential reweighing and couldn't bear the thought of public humiliation. "I was to retrieve the pouches discreetly and retie the weight tags with fresh string." Mr. Weatherby stepped forward, his weathered face bearing an expression of bitter satisfaction. "So the great scientific farmer was nothing but a common cheat. 30 years my family's been winning honest prizes, and this newcomer thought he could buy victory with lead shot and fancy theories." Inspector Slack made careful notes while considering these revelations. "Mrs. Blackwood, when you were behind the corn sheaf retrieving these pouches, did you encounter anyone else?" The widow nodded reluctantly. "Someone brushed past me in considerable haste. I felt a feather tickle my cheek and heard fabric tearing. There was a small popping sound, like a button snapping under tension." This testimony drew immediate attention to the brass button Inspector Slack had discovered earlier, and to the various villagers whose clothing might have sustained such damage. Miss Finch's bottle-green coat hung on the vicarage pegs, conspicuously missing a button from its middle position. Constable Evans, following Inspector Slack's gestured instructions, conducted a more thorough search behind the corn sheaf. He emerged with a small tuft of green feather down caught in the frayed twine, and more significantly, a broken hat pin tip stained with what appeared to be dried blood. "The murder weapon," Dr. Haydock confirmed after examining the steel fragment. "A hat pin, driven with considerable force, could easily create the puncture wound I observed. The decorative head has been removed, leaving only the deadly spike." Miss Marple's needles resumed their gentle rhythm as she processed these interconnected revelations. The theatrical staging of the crime scene, the careful manipulation of evidence, and the systematic attempt to frame an obvious suspect all pointed to a mind capable of considerable cunning, someone who understood village psychology well enough to orchestrate an elaborate deception. But there was something else, a detail that nagged at Miss Marple's experienced intuition. Mrs. Blackwood's confession, while explaining the lead shot and her presence at the scene, raised new questions about timing and opportunity. If she had been behind the corn sheaf retrieving evidence of her husband's cheating, who had been with Mr. Blackwood during his final moments, the investigation had revealed layers of deception that went far beyond simple horticultural rivalry, exposing a web of secrets that threatened to entangle half the village in suspicion and guilt. The bloodied hat-pin fragment had transformed the investigation from a crime of passion into something far more calculated. Yet, Inspector Slack found himself grappling with an increasingly complex web of evidence that seemed to point in multiple directions simultaneously. The discovery that the carving knife was merely theatrical staging had eliminated the obvious weapon, but the broken hat pin raised new questions about premeditation and opportunity. "Miss Finch," Inspector Slack addressed the woman whose missing button had made her an immediate suspect. Your coat displays a gap where a brass button should be. And Mrs. Blackwood described encountering someone whose passage resulted in fabric tearing and a button snapping under tension. Yet you maintain this damage occurred days ago on a railway journey. Miss Finch drew herself up with defensive hauteur, though her hands trembled as she adjusted her elaborate pea-green hat. I've told you repeatedly, Inspector, I lost that button on Tuesday's train. My sister will confirm we searched the entire carriage compartment. Mrs. Sampson nodded with loyal determination, though Miss Marple detected the slight hesitation that suggested sisterly solidarity rather than certain recollection. The widow's devotion was touching, but hardly constituted reliable testimony. Dr. Haydock, meanwhile, had been examining the brass button, recovered from the crime scene with professional thoroughness. Inspector, this button shows blue thread in its attachment holes, quite thick, almost navy in color. The stitching appears recent and rather hurried. Inspector Slack approached Miss Finch's bottle green coat hanging on the vicarage pegs and examined the remaining buttons with renewed interest. These show brown thread, Inspector, Miss Marple observed gently, having moved closer, as if to admire the garment's construction. Quite neatly waxed, suggesting careful maintenance over time. The contrast was immediately apparent even to Constable Evans, who nodded as if he'd made the discovery himself. Inspector Slack's expression showed both relief and frustration. Relief at eliminating a convenient suspect, frustration at losing what had seemed like clear evidence. Nevertheless, Inspector Slack continued, you were observed near the gate around 3 o'clock, and Mrs. Price Ridley specifically mentioned seeing a pea-green feather behind the corn sheaf. My feather is faded pea-green, Miss Finch protested with renewed confidence. Not the vulgar bright shade Mrs. Price Ridley described. And I certainly wouldn't push through those stalks, my stockings would be ruined. Mrs. Price Ridley, summoned by this reference to her testimony, declared crisply, there is indeed a distinction between faded elegance and vulgar brightness, Inspector. I maintain my observation of the latter variety. While this millinery debate continued, young Tommy Simmons had been hovering nervously at the edge of the group, his pale face showing the strain of the afternoon's events. Finally, he approached Inspector Slack with obvious reluctance, his small hand extended. Inspector? Sir? I found this when Grandfather and me were checking the corn sheaf arrangement after everyone went to the vicarage. It was caught in the frayed twine, where someone cut through my knots. He opened his palm to reveal a small, intricately carved, wooden acorn, no larger than his thumb, with a neat hole drilled through its center. The decorative piece bore a faint, dark stain and showed the metallic glint of something that had been recently polished to a high shine. Dr. Haydock took the carved acorn with immediate interest, comparing it to the broken hat-pin fragment he'd examined earlier. This is undoubtedly the decorative head of our murder weapon, Inspector. The break pattern matches perfectly, and this dark stain appears to be blood, though there's also evidence of some kind of polishing compound, quite unusual for something used in violence. The discovery sent a ripple of excitement through the assembled villagers, though Miss Marple noted how several faces showed more calculation than surprise. The hat-pin head, found at the very scene where the twine had been deliberately cut, suggested someone had taken considerable care in arranging the evidence trail. Where exactly was this located, Tommy? Inspector Slack inquired, his notebook ready. Right behind the corn sheaf, sir, tangled in the hemp twine where it was cut. Grandfather taught me to tie proper knots that don't come loose easy. Someone used a sharp blade to get through them quick-like. Old Ben Simmons stepped forward with quiet authority. Boy's right, Inspector. Those knots were cut, not untied. Someone needed fast access behind that display and couldn't waste time with proper rope work. Miss Marple observed the reactions to this discovery with her characteristic gentle attention, noting how Mrs. Blackwood's face had grown notably paler and how her gloved hands had resumed their nervous trembling. The widow's earlier confession about retrieving the lead shot pouches had placed her at the scene, but the discovery of the hat-pin head raised new questions about timing and opportunity. The polishing compound is particularly interesting, Dr. Haydock continued, examining the carved acorn under better light. This suggests someone took considerable care in preparing this implement, hardly the behavior one would expect in a crime of passion. Inspector Slack made careful notes while considering the implications. The theatrical staging of the crime scene, the careful manipulation of evidence, and now the discovery of a meticulously prepared murder weapon all pointed to a mind capable of considerable cunning and advanced planning. Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as she processed these interconnected revelations. The carved acorn head, with its evidence of careful polishing and deliberate placement, suggested someone who understood village psychology well enough to orchestrate an elaborate deception. Yet the very precision of the arrangement raised questions about whether they were meant to discover these clues in exactly this sequence. In her long experience with human nature, Miss Marple had learned that the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most helpful in their own investigation, carefully guiding suspicion toward convenient targets while maintaining an appearance of shocked innocence. The Pumpkin Gate mystery was revealing layers of deception that went far beyond simple horticultural rivalry, and she found herself increasingly convinced that the true solution lay not in any single piece of evidence, but in understanding the psychological sophistication required to orchestrate such an elaborate charade. As evening shadows lengthened across the village green, the investigation had taken yet another unexpected turn, leaving Inspector Slack with more questions than answers, and Miss Marple with the growing certainty that someone among the assembled villagers possessed a far more calculating mind than their rural appearance might suggest. Evening crept across the village green with that particular quality of English autumn light that softened harsh edges while somehow making details more distinct. Inspector Slack, unwilling to leave matters unsecured, had directed the careful preservation of all evidence, though Miss Marple observed how the lengthening shadows seemed to encourage whispered conversations and furtive glances among the assembled villagers. Old Ben Simmons approached Inspector Slack with the measured dignity of a craftsman who had something important to contribute. "Inspector, sir. About that carved acorn head, I should mention that I made several such pieces last Michaelmas for the ladies' craft stall. Fine English oak from the churchyard prunings, carved with proper attention to detail." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused almost imperceptibly as she absorbed this revelation. "How many such pieces did you create, Mr. Simmons?" 6 acorns, 3 oak leaves, all with holes drilled for mounting on hatpins or brooches," Ben replied with the precision of someone who took pride in his work. Price Ridley purchased several for the Women's Institute, and I recall a lady with a particularly bright green hat admiring the craftsmanship. Inspector Slack made careful notes while Dr. Haydock continued his examination of the carved acorn head. "The polishing compound is quite distinctive, Inspector. Someone took considerable care in preparing this piece, far more attention than one would expect for something intended as a weapon." "Indeed," Miss Marple observed gently, her attention drifting to the various faces around them. "Such meticulous attention to detail suggests someone with very particular standards about presentation. Even in the most unfortunate circumstances, some people simply cannot resist maintaining proper appearances." Blackwood, who had been sitting quietly since her confession about the lead shot, suddenly looked up with renewed distress. "Inspector, there's something else about my husband's materials. Cornelius imported specialized items from London, carved wooden markers, foreign fertilizers, even polishing compounds for his tools. He was most particular about maintaining everything in pristine condition." This revelation drew Inspector Slack's immediate attention. "Number 3. You're saying the polishing compound might have come from your husband's own supplies?" "It's quite possible," Mrs. Blackwood admitted reluctantly. "He kept everything in the potting shed, properly labeled and organized. Anyone familiar with his methods would know exactly where to find such materials." Miss Marple found herself increasingly intrigued by the psychological implications. Someone had not only used Mr. Blackwood's imported oak for the weapon, but had also employed his own polishing compound to prepare it a level of calculated irony that suggested intimate knowledge of the victim's habits and possessions. Inspector Slack had moved to examine the competition records more closely, and under the stronger light of the parish hall, curious details began to emerge. Miss Marple, your suggestion about the weight ledger has proven most illuminating. There are indeed pencil notations beneath the ink entries, and what appears to be erased figures suggesting earlier calculations. Dr. Haydock joined the examination, angling the pages to catch the light properly. The alterations show considerable anxiety, Inspector. Someone made multiple attempts to achieve the desired figures, with evidence of erasure and rewriting throughout. Mrs. Blackwood. Inspector Slack addressed the widow directly. You mentioned that your husband was concerned about documentation. Did he make these alterations himself? The widow's face grew notably paler. Cornelius was terrified of discovery. Inspector, he spent hours recalculating weights and adjusting entries to ensure everything appeared legitimate. But he also mentioned receiving correspondence about his methods. What sort of correspondence? Mrs. Blackwood's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. A letter, Inspector. Someone who knew about the lead shot enhancements. They demanded he withdraw from the competition or face public exposure of his cheating. The implications of this revelation sent a ripple through the assembled villagers. Someone had discovered Mr. Blackwood's deception and had attempted blackmail before resorting to murder. Do you still have this letter? Inspector Slack inquired with renewed urgency. Cornelius burned it immediately. Mrs. Blackwood replied miserably. He was convinced that withdrawal would constitute an admission of guilt. He decided to proceed with the competition and remove all evidence afterward. That's why I was behind the corn sheaf with the lead-shot pouches. Miss Marple's attention had shifted to observe the reactions of various villagers to this revelation. She noted how Mrs. Price Ridley's usually composed features showed a flicker of something that might have been calculation, while several others displayed the sort of nervous tension that suggested uncomfortable secrets. It was at this moment that young Tommy Simmons came running from the direction of the church vestry, his face flushed with excitement and alarm. Inspector, there's smoke coming from the parish hall storage room. The group hurried to investigate, finding wisps of acrid smoke curling from beneath the storage room door. Inspector Slack forced the lock and discovered a small fire smoldering in a metal wastebasket, the remnants of blue ribbons, prize cards, and what appeared to be several lengths of navy thread, all carefully arranged for burning. Someone's been destroying evidence, Dr. Haydock observed, examining the partially burned materials. These ribbons appeared to be from the competition entries, and this thread. He held up a singed length of navy blue fiber. This matches the thread mentioned in connection with the brass button. Miss Marple knelt beside the wastebasket with careful attention, her experienced eye cataloguing details that others might overlook. Among the ashes, she discovered a small fragment of what appeared to be writing paper bearing the partial impression of careful handwriting in blue ink. Inspector, she said quietly, you might find this fragment interesting. It appears to be part of a letter, possibly the threatening correspondence Mrs. Blackwood mentioned. Inspector Slack examined the paper fragment with growing interest. Though most of the text had been consumed by flames, faint traces of words remained. Improper methods and public exposure, along with what might have been the beginning of a signature. The discovery that someone had attempted to destroy evidence while the investigation was in progress suggested a calculating mind operating under considerable pressure. Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that they were dealing with someone who possessed both the cunning to plan an elaborate murder and the psychological sophistication to manipulate the subsequent investigation. The timing is most significant, Miss Marple observed to Inspector Slack as they examined the burned evidence. Someone felt compelled to destroy these materials during our investigation, suggesting they contained information that would prove particularly damaging to the perpetrator. As evening shadows deepened around the parish, The hall, the Pumpkin Gate mystery had revealed yet another layer of calculated deception. The burned evidence, combined with Mrs. Blackwood's revelation about the threatening letter, painted a picture of someone who had moved from blackmail to murder when their initial plan failed someone with intimate knowledge of the victim's secrets and access to his specialized materials. Miss Marple resumed her knitting with the patient attention of someone who understood that the most revealing moments often came when people thought themselves unobserved, and she found herself increasingly certain that the true solution lay not in any single piece of evidence, but in understanding the psychological profile of someone meticulous enough to polish a murder weapon while calculating enough to destroy evidence under the very noses of the investigating authorities. The discovery of the burned evidence had cast an entirely new shadow over the investigation, transforming what had appeared to be a crime of passion into something far more calculated and premeditated. Inspector Slack arranged for the partially burned materials to be carefully preserved, though Miss Marple observed how the very act of destroying evidence during an active investigation suggested both considerable nerve and intimate knowledge of what might prove damaging. "The timing troubles me most," Inspector Slack confided to Dr. Haydock as they examined the charred remains. "Someone felt compelled to destroy these materials while our investigation was actively proceeding. That suggests someone operating under considerable pressure." Reverend Clement, grave and steady, produced his keys to Ivy Cottage, Mrs. Blackwood, having entrusted them to him when her husband's body was discovered. "Perhaps we should examine Mr. Blackwood's potting shed before darkness falls completely," he suggested. "If someone has been using his materials, there might be evidence of disturbance." The potting shed proved a testament to Cornelius Blackwood's meticulous nature. Shelves bore labeled jars in precise blue ink, pumice fine grade, Polish compound, sap sealant imported. Muslin squares were folded with military precision. String coiled in tidy skeins, and narrow steel shafts lay arranged like knitting needles in a wooden drawer. Several bore decorative heads, oak leaves, and acorns, unmistakably of Ben Simmons's carving. Miss Marple's attention focused on one empty slot in the drawer. The label beneath, in Blackwood's tidy handwriting, read, "Acorn number 4. Anyone familiar with his methods would know exactly where to find what they needed," Inspector Slack muttered, examining a small tin marked "Compound Polish." "Fine." A rag lay beside it, stiffened at one edge with a reddish discoloration that might have been rust or something more sinister. Dr. Haydock lifted a small spool from the corner. "Navy thread, the very shade we noted on the recovered button." Miss Marple observed the faint crescent gouge in the floorboards near the bench, as if made by a narrow heel pivoting under stress. The mark joined other details in her methodical mental catalogue: the heel impression behind the corn sheaf, the careful arrangement of evidence, the theatrical staging that suggested someone who couldn't resist tidying even a murder scene. Upon returning to the parish hall, they found Miss Hartnell, the postmistress, waiting breathlessly with an envelope clutched in her hand. This was in the vicarage letterbox, no stamp, no address beyond the Reverend's name. "After the fire," I thought. Inspector Slack slit it open with his penknife. The single sheet within was neatly typed. "Until you act against improper methods, your parish festivals will be subject to public exposure. Standards must be maintained." "A continuation of the same theme," Dr. Haydock observed, "only now with a typewriter." Miss Marple accepted the paper when Inspector Slack offered it, noting the prim, admonitory language that read like minutes from an overzealous committee. "Typewritten removes the inconveniences of handwriting," she murmured, "though not always the habits of phrase." Mrs. Price Ridley's expression flickered when the word "standards" was read no more than a tightening about the mouth, but Miss Marple noted it carefully. The Women's Institute secretary had grown increasingly agitated throughout the afternoon, her usual authoritative demeanor giving way to something approaching nervous tension. "Who has access to a typewriter in the village?" Inspector Slack demanded. "The Women's Institute keeps a portable for notices." Reverend Clement replied, while Mrs. Price Ridley patted her reticule and produced a key with faint defensiveness. We maintain strict custody. Yet someone lit a fire in your storage during our inquiry, Inspector Slack observed pointedly. Miss Marple watched Mrs. Price Ridley's face carefully. It takes very little time to set paper smoldering if one has prepared the basket beforehand. A thoughtful soul might even fold ribbons and thread neatly old habits asserting themselves under pressure. Mrs. Blackwood, white and rigid, stared at the typed sheet. Cornelius said the letter writer had a moral tone. He mocked it privately, called it sermonizing. Young Tommy approached with his grandfather, whispering urgently. Ben Simmons cleared his throat, begging pardon, Inspector. But the gate latch, someone's loosened the screw. It weren't loose this morning. That blue ribbon holding it open would never have held otherwise. He placed a small, greasy screw on the table, bright brass, head nicked by a tool. The tiny object seemed to accuse silently, another piece of evidence suggesting someone who must tidy even their crimes, arranging every detail for maximum effect while ensuring their own escape remained undetected. Miss Marple smiled gently and tucked her knitting away, her mind cataloguing the psychological profile emerging from the evidence, someone who valued proper procedures above individual considerations, who might view murder as simply another form of administrative correction when conventional methods proved inadequate. The brass screw glinting on the parish hall table seemed to focus Inspector Slack's attention with renewed intensity. Though Miss Marple observed how Mrs. Price Ridley's gaze kept returning to it with something approaching fascination, there was something in the woman's manner that suggested not mere curiosity, but the sort of proprietary interest one might show toward a tool that had served its purpose. Inspector, Miss Marple said gently, rising from her chair with deliberate care. I wonder if we might impose upon Mrs. Price Ridley's expertise one final time. Women's Institute typewriter should be examined, and I believe she would be most helpful in demonstrating its proper operation. Price Ridley's face showed a flicker of something, pride perhaps, or the reflexive pleasure of someone asked to display professional competence. Certainly, Miss Marple, the Institute maintains the highest standards of equipment care. They proceeded to the small committee room where the portable typewriter resided in its locked cabinet. Mrs. Price Ridley produced the key with characteristic efficiency, her movements precise and economical as she arranged the machine on the table with mathematical exactness, the carriage aligned to the edge, paper guides positioned with ruler-straight precision. You handle the machine with remarkable familiarity, Miss Marple observed, watching as Mrs. Price Ridley automatically adjusted the ribbon tension and checked the type bar alignment. Such professional competence must come from years of regular correspondence. 43 years of institute minutes, festival notices, and correspondence with county headquarters, Mrs. Price Ridley replied with unmistakable satisfaction. Proper documentation requires proper tools, properly maintained. Inspector Slack examined the machine while Mrs. Price Ridley demonstrated its operation, noting how the E key struck slightly higher than its neighbors, and how a small chip in the end created a distinctive impression. When he compared these characteristics to the threatening letter, the match was unmistakable. The typing shows remarkable consistency, Miss Marple commented thoughtfully. No corrections, no hesitation marks. Someone quite comfortable with both the machine and the language of official correspondence. Mrs. Price Ridley's hands stilled on the keys. I pride myself on accurate first drafts, Miss Marple. Erasures and corrections suggest insufficient preparation. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed gently. Though I notice you've been carrying your sewing kit today, such a practical habit. Might we see it? I've always admired the Women's Institute's attention to proper maintenance. With visible reluctance, Mrs. Price Ridley opened her reticule and produced a small leather case containing scissors, thimble, and several spools of thread. Among them, a length of navy blue fiber caught the gaslight with unmistakable familiarity. Dr. Haydock examined the thread with professional interest. The exact shade we noted on the recovered button, Inspector. Quite distinctive, not the sort one finds in ordinary household supplies. Institute thread is specially ordered, Mrs. Price Ridley said defensively. We maintain consistent colors for our various projects. Miss Marple's attention had shifted to the small screwdriver nestled among the sewing implements, a stubby, well-used tool showing a diagonal nick in its blade. Such foresight. Carrying proper tools. One never knows when adjustments might be necessary. Inspector Slack lifted the screwdriver, comparing its nicked blade to the brass screw they'd discovered. The match was precise, metal scarred by metal in a pattern as individual as a fingerprint. Mrs. Price Ridley, Miss Marple said with gentle inexorability, you've spent decades maintaining standards in this village. When you discovered Mr. Blackwood's deception with the lead shot, your first instinct was to demand proper behavior through official channels. But when he dismissed your concerns as quaint moral posturing, something rather more drastic became necessary. The woman's composure began to crack like autumn ice, her carefully maintained facade revealing the rigid obsession beneath. He laughed at everything we've built here, called our traditions amateur theatricals, said scientific methods would always triumph over sentimental nonsense. So you retrieved one of Mr. Simmons's carved acorn heads from your institute purchases. Miss Marple continued softly. Polished it with Mr. Blackwood's own imported compound, such attention to proper finish, and waited behind the corn sheaf for a private moment to reason with him. Mrs. Price Ridley's voice, when it came, carried the hollow ring of someone whose world had collapsed around carefully maintained principles. I only meant to frighten him into proper behavior. But when he turned away dismissively, suggesting I should modernize my thinking and accept that progress required abandoning outdated notions of fair play, the confession emerged with the same methodical precision that had characterized all her village. The work, the careful planning, the attention to detail, even the compulsive need to tidy the crime scene with theatrical staging that would direct suspicion elsewhere. You loosened the gate screw to ensure quick escape, Inspector Slack observed, and when our investigation proved more thorough than expected, you felt compelled to destroy the evidence you'd so carefully preserved. Mrs. Price Ridley nodded miserably, her 43 years of maintaining village standards having led her to the ultimate administrative correction, murder itself, performed with the same meticulous attention to proper procedure that had governed her entire life. As Constable Evans stepped forward with handcuffs, Miss Marple felt the familiar mixture of satisfaction and sadness that accompanied the resolution of human tragedy. Knowing that the Pumpkin Gate mystery had revealed not just a crime, but the dangerous extremes to which the pursuit of perfection could drive even the most respectable souls. The handcuffs clicked with metallic finality around Mrs. Price Ridley's wrists, though she maintained her characteristic rigid posture even in defeat, as if proper deportment remained essential regardless of circumstances. The parish hall fell into that peculiar silence that accompanies the collapse of long-held certainties, broken only by the gentle rhythm of Miss Marple's knitting needles as she observed the human drama, with her characteristic blend of compassion and clear-eyed understanding. You saw it all along, didn't you, Miss Marple? Inspector Slack asked with newfound respect. His notebook still poised, though the case had reached its inevitable conclusion. Miss Marple smiled with gentle sadness, her keen eyes taking in the faces around them, some shocked, others relieved, all struggling to comprehend how their pillar of respectability had become a calculating murderer. One observes patterns, Inspector. In villages such as ours, human nature reveals itself in the smallest details, and Mrs. Price Ridley's nature was always remarkably consistent. She began to untangle the threads of deception with the same methodical care she applied to her knitting, each revelation building upon the last with inexorable logic. The anonymous letter threatening Mr. Blackwood was our first clue not to the identity of the writer, but to their character. The language was distinctly administrative. Improper methods, public exposure, standards must be maintained. These were the phrases of someone accustomed to official correspondence, someone for whom moral authority was synonymous with procedural correctness. Mrs. Price. Ridley's face remained impassive, though her hands trembled slightly within their restraints. Miss Marple continued with characteristic gentleness, as if explaining a particularly complex stitch pattern to an attentive student. When Mr. Blackwood dismissed her concerns, perhaps even mocked her adherence to outdated standards, Mrs. Price Ridley's sense of outrage, coupled with her ingrained need to correct what was wrong, drove her to take administrative action of the most final sort. Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily. She knew his habits intimately, you see. The Women's Institute maintains detailed records of all village activities, including the contents of members' gardens and workshops. Dr. Haydock nodded grimly as the psychological profile became clear. She used his own materials against him, the carved acorn from Ben Simmons that she'd purchased for Institute projects, one of Mr. Blackwood's steel hatpins, even his imported polishing compound. It was a weapon crafted with chilling intimacy. The meticulous preparation revealed her character perfectly, Miss Marple observed. Even while committing murder, she couldn't abandon her standards of proper presentation. The polished weapon, the carefully arranged crime scene, even the theatrical placement of the carving knife, all suggested someone who simply cannot tolerate untidiness, even in violence. Inspector Slack consulted his notes with renewed understanding. The button we found belonged to her Institute blazer navy thread, not brown like Miss Finch's coat. She lost it, squeezing behind the corn sheaf in her haste to escape. Yet even in panic, she maintained her methodical approach. Miss Marple continued softly. The gate latch loosened with her own screwdriver. We found it in her sewing kit, bearing the exact nick pattern of the recovered screw. The blue ribbon tied with deliberate clumsiness to suggest amateur work, when everything else about the crime showed professional attention to detail. Mrs. Price Ridley finally spoke, her voice carrying that hollow quality of someone whose carefully constructed world had collapsed entirely. He laughed at everything we've built here, Miss Marple, called our traditions amateur theatricals, said scientific progress required abandoning sentimental attachment to fair play. And when he turned away dismissively, Miss Marple said with gentle understanding, suggesting you modernize your thinking or step aside for those with more progressive attitudes. Something inside you simply corrected the situation. The confession that followed possessed the same methodical precision that had characterized Mrs. Price Ridley's 43 years of village administration. She described waiting behind the corn sheaf, the brief confrontation, the swift upward thrust of the modified hatpin as Mr. Blackwood turned away with superior disdain. Death had been nearly instantaneous, but the aftermath required proper management. The scene needed appropriate staging, she explained with chilling pragmatism. Mr. Weatherby's public resentment provided obvious motive, while the carving knife offered clear misdirection. I simply arranged evidence that would support logical conclusions. Miss Marple observed how, even in confession, the woman couldn't resist justifying her actions in administrative terms. Yet you couldn't abandon your standards entirely. When our investigation proved more thorough than expected, you felt compelled to destroy evidence, but even then, you folded the ribbons neatly, arranged the materials properly for burning, old habits asserting themselves under pressure. As Constable Evans prepared to escort the prisoner away, Mrs. Price Ridley turned back with one final administrative pronouncement. The festival records will require updating. Someone must ensure proper documentation of today's irregularities. The parish hall door closed behind them with quiet finality, leaving the assembled villagers to contemplate how the pursuit of perfection could drive even the most respectable souls to unthinkable extremes. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her experienced hands working steadily, while her mind reflected on the dangerous obsessions that could lurk beneath the most carefully maintained facades of rural propriety. The Pumpkin Gate mystery had revealed not just a crime, but the psychological complexity of human nature itself, how noble impulses toward order and fairness could, when taken to extremes, transform a pillar of village society into something far more sinister. In the gathering dusk, Mary Mead began the slow process of healing, while Miss Marple's gentle wisdom reminded them all that understanding human frailty was the first step toward forgiveness. The parish hall emptied with the subdued quiet that follows profound revelation, villagers dispersing into the gathering dusk with conversations muted by shock and disbelief. The afternoon's events had shattered more than Mr. Blackwood's prize pumpkin. They had fractured the community's fundamental assumptions about respectability and moral authority. Miss Marple remained in her corner chair, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm as she observed the human drama of a village coming to terms with darkness in their midst. Inspector Slack approached with newfound respect. His notebook finally closed after the most complex case of his rural career. "Your insights proved invaluable, Miss Marple. Without your attention to psychological details, we might have arrested Mr. Weatherby and considered the matter closed." Miss Marple smiled with characteristic gentleness, though her eyes held the sadness that always accompanied such revelations about human nature. "One learns to observe patterns, Inspector." Mrs. Price Ridley's character was remarkably consistent, her need for proper procedures, her intolerance of substandard behavior. When those impulses were challenged by someone who dismissed her authority entirely, the results were tragically predictable. Mrs. Bantry settled beside her friend with a profound sigh. "To think we trusted her with everything: festival organization, institute correspondence, moral guidance of our young people. How does one recover from such betrayal? By remembering that human nature contains both admirable qualities and dangerous extremes, often within the same individual." Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, "Mrs. Price Ridley's dedication served our village well for 43 years. It was only when those standards became more important than human compassion that they led her astray." Dr. Haydock had remained to complete medical documentation, fascinated by the psychological aspects. How someone could maintain such rigid standards while planning murder, yet still feel compelled to arrange the scene with theatrical precision. She simply couldn't abandon her nature, even in extremity, Miss Marple observed. The polished weapon, the carefully staged evidence, the compulsive need to destroy materials during our investigation all revealed someone for whom proper presentation remained essential regardless of circumstances. Reverend Clement approached with weary concern about practical matters. "Funeral arrangements will require delicate handling. Mr. Blackwood's London family must be notified, and there are questions about property disposition." Near the window, Mrs. Blackwood sat alone, staring at the village green where her husband's body had been discovered. Miss Marple noted her isolation with gentle compassion. "Mrs. Blackwood will need considerable support. She's lost not only her husband but her sense of security in what she believed was a peaceful community." Young Tommy Simmons remained with his grandfather, both visibly shaken by their carved acorn being perverted into a murder weapon. Old Ben approached Miss Marple with obvious distress. "Don't trouble yourself, Mr. Simmons," Miss Marple assured him kindly. "Your craftsmanship was transformed to purposes you never intended. The responsibility lies entirely with someone who chose to make beauty serve violence." As evening deepened, practical concerns began reasserting themselves. Festival displays required dismantling. Competition prizes needed distribution, and someone would assume Mrs. Price Ridley's administrative responsibilities until permanent arrangements could be made. The next morning brought tentative steps toward normalcy. Mr. Weatherby stood by the shattered pumpkin, remains with dignified acceptance rather than bitterness. "Waste," he murmured, though not unkindly. Tommy and Ben swept orange fragments into their barrow, retying the corn sheaf with proper slip knots, while Ben replaced the gate screw with satisfied precision. By afternoon, Ben Simons appeared at Miss Marple's cottage with a small brown parcel. Inside lay a simple oak leaf brooch, unpolished but beautifully carved. "A token," he said quietly, while Tommy added with scarlet embarrassment. "For seeing, ma'am." Miss Marple pinned the leaf to her cardigan with genuine pleasure, watching through her window as the gate stood straight again, its latch firm, the incriminating blue ribbon finally removed. The chestnut leaves rustled like pages turning in autumn's gentle breeze. "Will things return to normal?" Mrs. Bantry had asked during their walk home. Miss Marple had smiled with gentle wisdom. "Villages have remarkable resilience, my dear. We'll adapt, learn from this experience, and continue with perhaps deeper appreciation for the complexity within each of us." Mrs. Price Ridley's actions were inexcusable, but they remind us that the pursuit of perfection, taken to extremes, can become its own corruption. Mary Mead, chastened but resilient, settled into itself again, capable, as always, of both folly and grace. Miss Marple, who read both with equal patience, took up her evening knitting and counted her stitches, content to let life's patterns declare themselves when they chose, finding comfort in the enduring rhythms that sustained communities through even their darkest revelations about the human heart. 3 weeks had passed since the Pumpkin Gate mystery reached its tragic conclusion, and Street Mary Mead had begun the delicate process of healing that follows profound community trauma. Miss Marple sat in her garden on a crisp November morning, her knitting basket beside her, as she observed the subtle changes that had settled over the village like autumn mist, some visible, others felt only in the careful way neighbors now regarded one another. The oak leaf brooch from Ben Simmons caught the pale sunlight as she worked, a tangible reminder of how beauty could emerge from the darkest circumstances. When human nature chose grace over bitterness, through her garden gate, she could see the village green, where workmen had finally removed the last traces of the festival decorations, though the ancient iron gate itself remained, sturdy and unchanged, bearing silent witness to the events that had transformed their peaceful community. Mrs. Bantry arrived for their customary morning visit, settling into the garden chair with the comfortable familiarity of decades of friendship. "The county court proceedings concluded yesterday," she reported with careful neutrality. "Mrs. Price Ridley received a sentence of 15 years, with consideration for her age and previous exemplary service. Her solicitor argued diminished responsibility due to the strain of maintaining community standards for so many years." Miss Marple's needles paused thoughtfully. "One hopes the prison authorities will understand her need for structured routine. Sudden changes to established patterns would prove particularly difficult for someone of her temperament." The practical aftermath had indeed required careful management. Miss Hartnell, the postmistress, had temporarily assumed the Women's Institute secretarial duties, though her less exacting standards had caused minor administrative confusion. The autumn flower show had been quietly cancelled, while the Christmas pageant faced uncertain organization without Mrs. Price Ridley's meticulous planning. "Mrs. Blackwood departed for London yesterday," Mrs. Bantry continued, her voice carrying genuine sympathy. "She's accepted a position as housekeeper to her late husband's cousin. The cottage has been let to a retired schoolmaster from Surrey, a widower who keeps bees and shows no interest in competitive gardening." Miss Marple smiled gently at this news. The widow had visited her cottage the previous week, seeking understanding rather than absolution for her husband's deception. Their conversation had revealed a woman crushed not only by grief but by the knowledge that her marriage had been built upon scientific pretensions and competitive dishonesty. Mr. Weatherby had emerged from the tragedy with unexpected dignity, his 30-year winning streak intact and his traditional methods vindicated. He'd quietly claimed the Pumpkin Prize by default, though he donated the small monetary award to the Church Restoration Fund. Young Tommy Simmons had become something of a village hero for his careful attention to detail and brave assistance during the investigation. Dr. Haydock stopped by during his afternoon rounds, still fascinated by the psychological aspects of the case. "The prison psychiatrist's preliminary assessment confirms your observations, Miss Marple," Mrs. Price Ridley exhibits classic symptoms of obsessive-compulsive disorder with narcissistic tendencies, a dangerous combination when coupled with genuine authority and community respect. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her experienced understanding of human nature, having recognized these patterns long before medical terminology provided official classification. The tragedy lies in how her genuine dedication to community welfare became corrupted by the need to control others' behavior. When Mr. Blackwood dismissed her moral authority, she simply couldn't tolerate the challenge to her carefully constructed worldview. Inspector Slack had written a formal letter of commendation, acknowledging how her insights had prevented a serious miscarriage of justice. Colonel Melchett had expressed interest in consulting her on future cases involving complex village dynamics, though Miss Marple preferred her role as observer rather than official participant in criminal investigations. As afternoon shadows lengthened across her garden, Miss Marple reflected on the lessons embedded in the Pumpkin Gate mystery. The pursuit of perfection, whether in horticultural competition or moral authority, could become its own form of corruption when it valued abstract standards above human compassion. Mrs. Price Ridley's 43 years of exemplary service had been overshadowed by a single moment when her rigid principles demanded the ultimate administrative correction, yet the village's response had also revealed the resilience of genuine community bonds. Neighbors had rallied around Mrs. Blackwood despite her husband's deception, while Mr. Weatherby had shown remarkable grace toward those who had questioned his integrity. Young Tommy and his grandfather had transformed their inadvertent contribution to the crime into a lesson about the importance of careful observation and truthful testimony. The evening brought Reverend Clement for his weekly visit, their conversation touching on the theological implications of the tragedy. How does one reconcile Mrs. Price Ridley's genuine service with her terrible actions? He asked with pastoral concern. Miss Marple set down her knitting to consider this eternal question. Perhaps by remembering that human nature contains both light and shadow, Reverend. Our task isn't to judge but to understand, and to ensure our own pursuit of righteousness doesn't blind us to the humanity of those we seek to serve. As November darkness settled over Street Mary Mead, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared for the evening's quiet contemplation. The Pumpkin Gate mystery had ended, but its lessons would resonate through the village's collective memory, serving as a gentle reminder that the most dangerous extremes often lurked beneath the most respectable facades. The ancient gate stood silhouetted against the twilight, its iron framework unchanged by the human drama that had unfolded in its shadow. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and fresh mysteries. For villages like Street Mary Mead possessed an inexhaustible capacity for both folly and redemption. Miss Marple, patient observer of human nature's infinite complexity, settled into her evening routine with the quiet satisfaction of someone who understood that wisdom lay not in solving life's mysteries, but in accepting them with grace and continuing to knit the threads of community back together, one careful stitch at a time.